Now, successive governments of all colours have talked and legislated in a way that demonises other people. Not just immigrants, anyone who doesn't sound British or look British or practice a British religion, anyone who doesn't subscribe to British values, a phrase which I struggle to understand what it means and is so vague that it is just subject to the prejudices of whoever uses it.
Brexit will encourage the idea of insulation, and with that idea, the idea that Britain knows best. And for the reasons I've just given, that might be very unfortunate, certainly for those on the receiving end of the law, which pretty much like medicine and other skills is in large part a skill, not just political decision making. It is a skill, and it's a skill that works to identify real issues that are of general application for man and mankind. And therefore, Brexit is likely to harden the arteries of the thinking of the brain. Do arteries go to the brain? I think they do.
Does Brexit risk to trigger a process that will eventually lead the Conservative government to give effect to its pledge in the 2015 manifesto to repeal the Human Rights Act and even possibly to take the UK away from the Convention? Or conversely, could the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights obtain a whole new meaning after Brexit as the key human rights instruments in the UK at a time when we will no longer be able to rely upon EU law and the jurisprudence of the Court of Justice of the European Union for protection?
So my opening statement is, can we just park the word human? Because it is utterly confusing. So, for example, think about what Dimitrios said at the beginning, because in a sense this debate is pivoted on this issue of whether Britain is going to resolve from its commitment to the European Court in that way and the European Declaration on Human Rights. And you can immediately see that that relates to a supernatural structure. It's not directly tied to the EU, but it overlaps and folds over on top of the EU. And what makes it viable to some extent is the existence of the European community that enables, and this is surely the key thing that makes a nonsense of that word human rights, is in order to have a right, it needs to be enforceable. And what we're really talking about now is how, if we resile from the European Human Rights Convention, it's going to become less and less possible either to enforce certain kinds of sanction against people who've engaged in terrorist acts, or indeed to correctly understand what the mechanisms, what the activities of the secret state and the manifest state are in the pursuit of its aims.
Certain newspapers, step forward, the Daily Mail in particular, but the Express, the Star, the Sun, the Telegraph, have waged an unremitting war, frankly, against the Human Rights Act. You try and get the journalists who've spread the negative stories about human rights, you try and get them to come and stand up here and talk about it. They're really happy to sit on their backsides at their computers and spiel out these lies and exaggerations and crap and fake news. You try and get them to stand up here and defend themselves, they won't do it.
I've always felt very aware that the EU can be seen as partly a human rights organisation. And when there was talk of a referendum and possibly of the UK leaving the EU, that was one of the first things I started to worry about. What is going to happen to human rights?
The European Union mechanism has protected a number of rights, for example, worker rights, rights of community members, but third countries' nationals as well. And in a way, it's connected to the European Convention on Human Rights. So I am quite puzzled when the government says that they are going to come out of the European Union, but still retain the European Convention on Human Rights, because it will be quite a unique and I think unwieldy and unpractical way of engaging with human rights.
Immediately after the referendum, we called upon the government to unilaterally recognize full rights for all EU citizens currently in the UK. We feel that the government would thus reclaim the moral high ground and win hearts in the forthcoming negotiations, European hearts, that is.
A culture of acceptance and tolerance can also overcome the culture of exclusion. And this is a very important reassurance that the academic community has given to EU nationals and students in general. And it is a reassurance that the government has not given to EU students and national.
No one really knows whether they can leave or not, and those who are legally here can legally stay, but no one knows who's legally here, and no one knows what it means to legally stay.
What's so disappointing about the way that the bill passed is that the official Vote Leave campaign committed to protecting EU citizens' rights here in the UK, and then throughout, Theresa May and her government have come under pressure to confirm that their rights would be protected, to confirm that these were people and not bargaining chips in the process. And she's just resisted doing that, and it's really disappointing that Parliament hasn't stood up to her in the House of Commons and made sure that their rights are protected. I think it's absolutely right that there will be legal claims, and that we can expect that as the uncertainty continues and people are left in this really terrible state of limbo, people who have settled here and have families here, that they will look to the Human Rights Act to be able to make sure that their family life rights are protected, and that's of course only right.
Of the submissions that we received, most of those that were not sent institutionally came from individuals who were affected, and they raised a whole series of concerns. Some people were concerned that they might wish to retire to Europe and would be unable to do so. Some people were concerned that their partners were European nationals and that they may not be able to stay in the UK. People were very anxious. And the more we looked at this, the more complex it appeared to be.
But the agreement may relate to a sort of cut-off point, like the date of the referendum, and then some of the issues that we've been talking about will still apply to people who arrive after the date, where it will be easier for the government to maintain a position. But none of this is conclusive, is it? So
in future, having a European passport won't be enough to prove that you have the right to work the way it is now. But there will be these millions of people who will have some form of indefinite leave to remain and the right to work. So employers will have to distinguish between these different types of Europeans in a way which they simply don't have to at the moment.
So the question that the committee was looking at is, if you chuck out these EU nationals when the UK leaves the EU, is this a breach of their right to respect for their private and family life?
These rights are non-negotiable. All member states in the European Union are bound by the European Convention on Human Rights. So in many ways, here we're talking about a negotiation with rights that cannot be negotiated away. We should keep this in mind. The argument for unilateral recognition is also backed up by the right to private and family life as enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights. And that is an aspect, the international human rights aspect to this debate, that unfortunately has not been picked up enough. And we must stress that the EU27 and the UK will be bound, are bound by the European Convention on Human Rights, and are therefore must give recognition to the right to private and family life as soon as possible, hopefully through the resolution that Guy Verhofstadt has made reference to.
Thank you very much. That was the New Europeans, and now
a hugely political issue. And of course immigration was one of the key drivers in the referendum. So I think there's a really quite frightening mix here. And because, I'm not a lawyer, but what you've all said around the table, that this is not absolute anyway. I mean, I think this could be a really difficult area. I mean, given the politics and where the government's coming from and what happened in the referendum. So I just think we need real vigilance about this.
The point is that, indeed, existing ECHR jurisprudence provides a very strong basis for blocking potential deportations. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
No, you said that in our report.
But I think equally importantly, perhaps it's more of a grey area, but there is good scope, in my view, in the view of the experts that I represent today, that ECHR might also trigger potential claims for violation of the right to private and family life.
Has Parliament, via the European Communities Act, already given the executive the authority to invoke Article 50, that is, to cause a repeal of the European Communities Act itself by executive action. All the arguments sound convincing when you read them. And, but at the end of the day, will I hazard a guess? Yes, I'll hazard a guess, which is that the government will lose the appeal. Thank you.
We need to realize that what is at stake here, more generally, rather than just looking at the technical detail.
Absolutely.
Is a fundamental principle of UK constitutional law that parliamentary sovereignty reigns supreme. And one might say that it's very ironic for a government to fight against a principle that was that very much underpinned the whole case for Brexit. We wanted to take back control. We wanted to empower Parliament. So here is a golden opportunity, one might say, to give Parliament the final say.
Insisting that Parliament should have a major say in where the roadmap takes us. Now, this seems to me to be the single biggest issue that we are going to have to tease out over the coming months. What do we want from the European Union? And the idea that we can go into negotiations without having a clear idea and at least an enforced consensus, if not a real consensus, as to what we want to achieve, seems to me to be fraught with risk, because we will then be batted around all over the place. The Article 50 process is one-sided. It was deliberately designed to make it difficult to leave the EU. It produces a condition of massive uncertainty in the country that's leaving, and gives all the cards to the negotiators for the Commission and the Council on behalf of the Union.
It will keep in force, rather than repeal, most of the EU legislation that is in existence. It will simply convert it into UK law.
We start to demand our own say more, because we apparently don't trust politicians, even though politicians by and large are very trustworthy and mechanisms exist for making them trustworthy. We've resorted to using fundamentally majoritarian ideas like referendums, which themselves can threaten the foundation, the equilibrium of a liberal democracy.